This is Addiction Medicine Journal Club. I'm Dr. John Keenan.
And I'm Dr. Sonya Tredici.
And we believe that addiction is a disease that can be treated, and we want to help you stay up to date with the latest research that you can use in your addiction medicine practice. And now we are offering Category 1 CME through MyCares and Michigan State University. The links for the CME are in the show notes. This week, we are going to be discussing an article on cannabis use and cardiovascular outcomes. How are you doing tonight, Sonya?
I'm doing well. I am doing better than last time we recorded. I went to the allergist today and got my venom shots. If you remember, I almost died of a bee sting during our last recording. So I'm doing better.
Did you have any fallout from that between like the end of this podcast and the next day, or was it over?
No, I felt fine. For our listeners, I got stung by a wasp and I have a potentially fatal wasp and bee venom allergy. So I had to go take a Benadryl, and John very bravely wrote down my address in case I were to pass out during recording, and he had to call the paramedics.
Although my handwriting's pretty bad, I probably wouldn't be able to read. What number is that? That's Sixer?
They'd show up at my neighbor's house across the street.
Yeah. Break down the door.
Right. How are you doing?
Good. Just enjoying this early summer weather here in South Central PA. It's kind of the one true spring days today, which is really nice.
It's beautiful. It is a beautiful day today. So, John, what have you been thinking about in addiction medicine news this week?
So kind of like an ongoing update that we've talked about before. So this is from Stat Politics. It's called Biden administration puts menthol cigarette rule off indefinitely. So I think one thing that I've talked about before that I was really excited about is that, the FDA does have the ability to regulate tobacco products. And one thing that they looked at specifically is kind of flavored cigarettes, but also menthol cigarettes, which is something that disproportionately affects our Black communities. And there was a lot of talk over the past year about them basically banning the product altogether at some point. And so they did like a survey, a listening campaign. There's a lot of back and forth and feedback. And essentially at this point, they're kind of indefinitely pausing this endeavor to possibly ban menthol. And it's interesting. The reasons for it, like anything, they're very political. So it sounds like one is that, as we know, this disproportionately affects Black Americans who smoke at a higher rate in terms of using menthol cigarettes. About 80% of them do use menthol compared to a much smaller percentage in Caucasian smokers or other ethnicities, even though they smoke at equal rates. And so the thought was that kind of they're targeting those communities. They thought that it could possibly escalate tension with a Black market for menthol cigarettes between law enforcement and the Black community. And then also it's an election year. So it's interesting that those three things were primary drivers here, which was kind of disappointing.
Well, it is disappointing because, the menthol is one of those additives. It's kind of like they're trying to ban the flavored vape liquid, because it makes the smoking more palatable, makes it easier to smoke, makes it more appealing to smoke. And those products should be banned.
Yeah, it's interesting. This has entered like my smoking cessation counseling for many patients. I often ask them when they smoke menthol, if they smoke other cigarettes. Oftentimes they won't, they'll refuse to. And I've actually kind of queried them like, there's a possible ban coming for this. Do you think you would quit smoking if that was banned and you had no other choice but to smoke alternative cigarette without menthol? And many people said that would make it much easier for them to quit. At least that's what they tell me during the visit.
Well, right. I mean, I think those flavors are targeted to increase the habit, because it's not just the nicotine, it's the whole smell and taste and habit overall that really drives some of the addictive behavior with smoking. And menthol is part of that.
Yeah, definitely.
Can't get over soon enough.
So I guess we'll see what happens after the election cycle. How about you? What's up with the news with you?
So more substance regulation. I've been reading about a DEA proposal to reclassify marijuana, and it's on theme with the article I'm going to present today. So on May 16th, which was just about, 2 weeks before recording this episode, the DEA officially proposed to move marijuana from Schedule 1, meaning no accepted medical use, to Schedule 3, which it means there's some acceptable medical use and kind of a medium risk. So other things in Schedule 3 are ketamine, buprenorphine, anabolic steroids, that kind of thing. Schedule 2 is more like oxycodone and higher risk medications. So it's a lengthy process. This doesn't mean that somehow it's going to be legal or going to be available or, that it'll even happen overnight. But if cannabis does get rescheduled to Schedule 3, it will make it much easier to study. At this point, it's very hard to conduct any kind of human trials for medical use because it's classified as a compound that has no acceptable medical use. It'll smooth over some administrative and tax issues for cannabis-based businesses because right now it's a Schedule 1 drug, so that complicates a lot of, what would be normal kind of business practices. And it makes logical sense given the potential therapeutic benefits of cannabis and the potential risks. It's already used for medical purposes all over the country, and it's just sort of silly to say it has no legitimate medical purpose. This isn't the same as legalizing it, of course. It doesn't say anything about recreational use, but I'll be really interested to see what happens. I don't think it'll make much of a difference in how people use it. The horse is out of the barn in terms of using cannabis. So I don't think people are going to go back and use it less if it's reclassified to a Schedule 3 drug and suddenly is available kind of as a prescription pill. But it'll just make it a little more, I don't know, sort of logical and coherent. What do you think about rescheduling it?
Without sounding too much like a skeptic, I think the biggest issue I hear, we've been at open forums. I remember at our organization at open forum with our PA Department of Health head, and interesting, like a lot of vocal anti-marijuana opinions from the majority of the physicians in the room. I think the biggest critique is that because it's Schedule 1, it's really not a studied substance like we would for other drugs, right? So we've kind of done this in reverse, right? So we've kind of like legalized it for medicinal purposes. Now we're rescheduling it and now we can study it. And now we're going to get our data a decade after it's already hit the streets as a quote medical treatment. And I do think there probably are some medicinal uses with it. I'm not going to disagree with that. I don't think there's as many as people are getting certified for. I think we are certifying many people for some very loose indications for this product. And I think that calling it medical marijuana really makes it sound more therapeutic than what it really is, which is basically like a legalized vice, sort of like alcohol. It's not like a harmless substance.
Well, and that's an excellent segue into the article I wanted to present, which was called Association of Cannabis Use with Cardiovascular Outcomes Among U.S. Adults. And it was published in March 2024 in the Journal of the American Heart Association. So I'm always excited to see potential addiction medicine articles in something like the Journal of the American Heart Association. It just shows how addiction medicine is found in kind of all branches of medicine. And I'm sure the American Heart Association has published some other addiction medicine ish articles over the years, but this is the first one I've presented here. And it's not an article dealing with substance use disorder or even like cannabis use disorder, but I'm at heart a primary care doctor and I deal with a ton of cardiovascular disease. So I really think the article will change my practice. And I actually have used the information in this article in my clinic just yesterday. So I've already started putting it to use. Like we talked about with the advent of medical cannabis, the increasing cultural acceptance and the decreased perceptions of harm, the loosening of legal restrictions, all of these have contributed to cannabis use increasing in the general population. About 23% of the US population has used cannabis, and 3.9% admit to using it almost daily, which is more than 300 days per year. In fact, just this week, a study came out using data from the National Study of Drug Use and Health, showing that daily or almost daily marijuana use was more common than daily or near daily alcohol use for the first time. And there is a super pretty graph from the article that I will share on social media showing the increased prevalence of marijuana use and comparing it to alcohol use. So, despite its common use, there is little known about the risks of cannabis since research has been hampered by its DEA status, like we said, and its rapidly changing use patterns. So, admitted use among adults at risk for cardiovascular disease was pretty low. That's usually older adults, and they were less likely to use cannabis. And there's a strong overlap with tobacco in older adults, and that confounder made it difficult to study the association between cannabis and cardiovascular disease alone. But now that the use is much more common, we can actually start to look for some of these associations. So that's what this article is about. The first thing we have to ask, because this is an article of harm, does this potentially toxic substance cause a harm, which is cardiovascular disease? And whenever you're looking at research about a harmful substance, one of the things you have to ask is it biologically plausible? Like, is it even plausible that cannabis would be a risk factor for cardiovascular disease? And it definitely is. And I wanted to share some of that information with our audience. So, first, there is other data on this topic. In fact, 3 other studies have looked at this question using some of the same data from the same type of survey that this study used, but none used as large a population or were as robust as this study. And those studies did find an association, but again, the data wasn't as strong. Also, physiologically, there are endocannabinoid receptors throughout the entire cardiovascular system. And THC has hemodynamic effects that cause stroke, that cause MI, that cause syncope. It's a stimulant. I had someone in the office earlier this week, tachycardic 140, heart is just racing, and he had been using cannabis right before coming into the office visit. And also inhalation, any particulate matter that you inhale is a cardiovascular risk factor, be it air pollution, tobacco smoke, cooking smoke, marijuana smoke as well. And finally, in animal models, cannabis has been shown to give rats heart disease. So, with these facts in mind, the association between cannabis and heart disease is very plausible. And I think it made good sense to ask this clinical question, which is what is the association between cannabis use and cardiovascular outcomes? So that's the question we're going to look at in this trial. This was a population based cross sectional study done at a single point in time. It included 434,104 people who filled out a questionnaire or responded to a questionnaire on the phone called the Behavioral Risk Factor Surveillance Survey. This is a survey that's done every year. It was done in 27 American states and 2 American territories, and it's performed by the CDC. It's supposed to be a cross section of the American population. And in 2016, they started including questions about cannabis as well as questions about alcohol and tobacco. So this study looked at the data starting in 2016 when they started including that question about cannabis. It includes adults age 18 to 74, and anyone who answered the cannabis question was included. They excluded people who didn't know what cannabis was or refused to answer the question or didn't know if they'd used cannabis or not. But basically, if you could answer the question about whether or not you used cannabis, you were in this study. So, who was in this study? They did collect a bunch of demographic data, which I think is pretty interesting in its own right. 4% of the people surveyed used cannabis daily. 7.1% used cannabis, but not every day. About 89% didn't use cannabis at all. So, most people were not using cannabis. 3.5% had coronary heart disease, 2.8% had had an MI, and 2.8% had had a stroke, with a composite of 7.4% had one of those 3 cardiovascular outcomes. Mean age was 45, and it was about half and half men and women. Like the American population overall, 60% were white, about 12% Black, and about 20% Hispanic. They also looked at educational attainment and other substance use. So 61% had never smoked tobacco. Alcohol use, about 4.3% used alcohol daily. About 48% had no alcohol use at all. And I think this is important. It is important for our patients to normalize that a lot of people don't use alcohol at all. Almost half of American adults don't drink any alcohol whatsoever. So we have patients who are like, well, how could you not drink? I'm like, well, half of adults in the US don't drink at all. And they're not all going to be sort of strange teetotalers. 32% had obesity, 10.6% had diabetes, and, kind of they did physical activity. So 77.7% admitted to at least one time having physical activity in the last month. I don't know quite why that's their measure, but it's also sad that 22% did not do any physical activity outside of their work in the past month. So that's the demographics who ended up in this study. And what they looked at is they compared cannabis use daily or non-daily, and it was more of a continuous variable. So it was how many days in the past 30 days have you used it? So you could say 2 days, 4 days, 10 days. They looked at that continuous variable and they compared it to no cannabis use at all. The outcomes were self-reported coronary artery disease, myocardial infarction, stroke, and a composite of all 3. And they had several pre-specified subgroups. So people who never smoked tobacco, men and women who were younger but higher risk for cardiovascular disease. But those were the main outcomes. Basically, coronary artery disease, myocardial infarction, stroke, and a composite. So it was a pretty simple survey in this clinical question. It wasn't super complicated. And I just want everyone to keep in mind that this is self reported study data. They didn't do any confirmation with medical records or biochemical confirmation of cannabis use. They didn't look at death records. Of course, you couldn't be in this study if you were dead because it was a telephone survey. There's no mortality data, though. It was just 16 simple telephone questions, and you could probably do it in a few minutes. So the questions were like, during the past 30 days, on how many days did you use marijuana or hashish? Or has a doctor, nurse, or other health professional ever told you that you had a heart attack, also called a myocardial infarction? It's a pretty simple survey. So the data from that survey is what's in this study. So, John, what did you think about the clinical question?
I mean, it seems to be kind of valid in many regards. Just one question. So, is basically they're just looking at the frequency of use. They're not looking at kind of volume or kind of subdividing this amongst how much is being consumed in each of these instances.
It was days. So they didn't say once a day, twice a day, 6 times a day.
It seems like it's a relatively kind of straightforward question, right? That seems clinically valid, right? Doesn't affect these outcomes, and just looking at it in very gross terms.
Yeah, I mean, right, it's not a super finely crafted study. A little bit blunt, but easy to understand. So let's talk about strengths and weaknesses. I do think this was a valid trial, but definitely there were some things about this data that made it hard to be really, really confident of its conclusions. So starting with strengths, the population in the study reflects the overall American demographics, so it is definitely generalizable. The subgroups were pre-specified and they were pretty limited. They didn't try to make too many subgroups. I really like this. They really looked at a dose response curve and looked for greater risk for those who used more cannabis and greater risk for those who were at greater baseline risk. So if they could find a dose response, this increases the likelihood that the exposure you're studying, which in this case is cannabis, is really a toxic substance responsible for the outcome if you can show a dose response curve. Their statistical analyses were appropriate. They did a multivariate logistic regression of the association of the lifetime occurrence of coronary heart disease, MI, stroke, and the composite as a function of the underlying demographics. And then they redid their analyses among those who had never used tobacco and who had never used nicotine products. And that was very interesting. They did 6 different sensitivity analyses, which did continue to demonstrate the same findings. They used propensity score matching to compare daily and non-daily users. That was interesting. They also did something good, which is looking at the synergistic effects between cannabis and tobacco, as well as other nicotine-containing products. And then they also did analyses to try to separate out cannabis use and tobacco use, since tobacco has been a major confounder in other studies of cannabis and heart disease. There were very few missing values. People who did the survey, most of them answered all the questions. There were fewer than 1% of values were missing. And I thought the outcomes were clinically relevant, but I did have some concerns that many patients don't know what coronary heart disease is. So if you're asked if you had coronary heart disease, I'm not sure if my patients would know exactly what that question means. So they might say no, even if they do have it. There were some weaknesses. The first is that over the study time period, which was 2016 to 2020, cannabis became legal, both medically and recreationally, in many of the states studied. So cannabis use really increased, but I'm not sure that the incidence of heart disease changed at all. So I'm not sure how that would have affected the outcomes, but there's a major cultural shift in cannabis use over those 4 years. Data was self reported and subject to recall bias. You could assume that cannabis use, especially early on, was underreported as it uses for many different substances, which would probably bias the results towards the null. So the association may be even stronger than was reported in this study if people are underreporting their cannabis use. The other thing that's difficult is that the groups were significantly different at baseline. So people who use daily cannabis, non daily cannabis, or no cannabis were not the same. And they tried to adjust for these differences, but I'm sure there are definitely some unmeasured confounders, which were not measured in the study, leading to differences in the 3 groups beyond their cannabis use patterns. Another thing that's a little difficult is that this is a point in time study. It was one point in time in terms of marijuana use. It said over the past 30 days, how many days have you used marijuana? But it didn't say over the past 30 days, have you had an MI? It was like, have you ever had an MI? It looked at cardiovascular disease anytime in your life, but marijuana use only in the past 30 days. So it actually means that reverse causality could be possible, that maybe the cardiovascular disease came first and then you started using cannabis. It makes it harder to prove causality. maybe you're so depressed and stressed after your heart attack, you start using cannabis to help you relax, you know? Another sort of problem physiologically is that the effects of cannabis on the cardiovascular system are probably reversible and temporary, just like the effects of tobacco. And so you really need to know what the people's past cannabis use is. And that's not reported in this study. You would want to know the patterns of cannabis use in the 15 years prior to their cardiovascular event, rather than their cannabis use now and their cardiovascular events in the past. So that time thing, I feel, is a little bit problematic. Finally, they included some cardiovascular risk factors, a lot of cardiovascular risk factors: tobacco use, age, sex, race, BMI, diabetes, alcohol, education level, physical activity. But they left out diet, neighborhood and zip code, family history, blood pressure, and cholesterol. They didn't have that data. And finally, the incidence of cardiovascular disease was pretty low because many people in the study were very young. And given the long time course for development of cardiovascular disease, if they surveyed the same population in 20 years who are using cannabis now, maybe we'd see more cardiovascular disease. I'm not sure. So I did have some concerns about this trial. John, did you think this was valid?
Yeah, actually, the one you just said that I didn't really think about is like, I do kind of wish they did put some demographics regarding like zip code specifically, since I think there is kind of a cultural and a socioeconomic association between both heart disease and duration of use of these products. I think that would have been really kind of relevant information.
Yeah, and I mean, I don't wanna knock this study. It was really interesting, and it was super popular. I was looking at the altmetrics score, and I think, I don't remember, 195 news outlets or something profiled it since it came out, like 2 months ago. It was got a lot of press, and it was very, widely read and published in a very good journal. So it is a good study. It is definitely a good study, so
Yeah, nothing against the study, but it's just tough because it's like, I guess it's how do you sort this out? My kind of daily marijuana smokers, they're not my marathon runners or my counting my macros patients. Not to kind of generalize here, but that normally isn't their only kind of unhealthy vice that they're engaged in. So how do you like separate and vice versa to compare them to other group of patients that maybe run every day and are very health conscious? They typically don't engage in these, so it's tough to compare.
right, it's hard to sort out the marijuana use alone as the only risk factor.
But association is a good start, right, for a conversation.
Well, and given the long time you need to develop cardiovascular disease, you're never gonna be able to do a randomized controlled trial. So all we have are associations. Once marijuana is able to be studied and more widely available, you could do a prospective cohort study. Follow people for 20 years and see what their marijuana use is like every year and see the development of heart disease. Like, that would be the next best thing. And hopefully that's, in the works somewhere. Someone has funding to do this. If you're doing that study, could you let us know? All right. You ready to hear about the results?
Yeah.
All right. So, 30-day past cannabis use was associated with adverse cardiovascular outcomes, with heavier use, i.e., more days per month, associated with higher odds of adverse outcomes. Most of the difference in the composite outcome was driven by higher rates of stroke. So, stroke was the most common adverse cardiovascular outcome for people who used more cannabis. So, that's the kind of bottom line one liner. In terms of the general population in this study, this primary outcome, again, prevalence of myocardial infarction, stroke, and coronary heart disease. The adjusted odds ratio for the association of daily cannabis use and coronary heart disease is 1.16. For myocardial infarction, it was 1.25. And for stroke, it was 1.42. And for the composite outcome, the adjusted odds ratio was 1.28. So that coronary heart disease one did not reach statistical significance, but the other two did, as did the composite outcome. And that adjusted odds ratio was higher the more days per month you used marijuana. So there was a statistically significant and clinically pretty large association between cannabis use and stroke and myocardial infarction. The data were adjusted, when we say adjusted odds ratio, for tobacco use, age, sex, race, BMI, diabetes, alcohol, education, and physical activity. You can see this same result in both daily and non-daily cannabis users, and they also included alcohol users. So they looked at the association between alcohol users and coronary heart disease, myocardial infarction, and stroke. And as we've talked about before, the association between alcohol use and cardiovascular health is kind of in flux. The current consensus seems to be that it has no protective effect, but in this study, alcohol use had a significant protective association with heart disease and stroke. So, again, this is kind of a blunt instrument and it's a point in time study, but alcohol came out on top on this one. They also produced some interesting dose response curves, which were pretty striking, showing that the more days of the month you use cannabis, the higher your risk of cardiovascular disease. Again, coronary heart disease was not significant in these association curves, but the others were. And those who use cannabis fewer days per month had proportionally lower odds ratios. And maybe I'll also put that graph on social media. Maybe that'll be my new thing. I'll post the exciting graphs from the papers on our social media groups. They looked at some pre-specified subgroups, so people who'd never smoked tobacco, which I think is very relevant because of the confounding effects of tobacco and cannabis. Among never tobacco smokers, daily cannabis use was still associated with myocardial infarction, stroke, and the composite outcome of heart disease in general. And in this population, alcohol also seems to be associated with lower cardiovascular risk. So, bottom line, among people who never smoked tobacco, daily cannabis use was also associated with myocardial infarction and stroke. Again, no statistically significant association with coronary heart disease. They looked at the relationship between cannabis and cardiovascular outcomes in men who were under age 55 and women under age 65 who had higher cardiovascular risk. And they also had an association. Stroke, again, was the most prominent risk as it was in other groups. But in this high risk group, younger high risk group, when they tested the association independent of the association with tobacco, that risk disappeared. So that really seemed to be driven by tobacco use in that younger group. In people who'd never smoked tobacco and were at high risk, that it's a small number of people, but cannabis was associated with stroke and coronary heart disease. They looked at some other pre-specified subgroups as well, people who just smoked cannabis, people who just smoked and didn't use any other method of cannabis, people who used just edibles, daily users, non-daily users. In those pre-specified subgroups, the associations with coronary heart disease, MI, and stroke were the same. So those are the results. John, what did you think?
I mean, I think it's kind of interesting to first start to some information about the effects of these products or kind of at least the associations. Certainly, I'm going to use it. I was surprised about the alcohol report, to be honest, after what we've talked about previously.
Yeah.
Kind of undid does a previous episode that we did.
It's true. We came down hard against alcohol in several other articles we presented. So
I don't know. I'm going to use this in my counseling, right? I feel like, kind of back to my original statement about marijuana used for like medicinal purposes. It's a product that's kind of been released beforehand. Like, what other medication or treatment do you offer someone where you don't have a list of side effects and to counsel them about before you start the treatment? I don't know.
right. Well, and especially since daily cannabis use is now more common than daily alcohol use, I think especially with people who view it medicinally and are taking it almost every day. A person who in my personal life who will remain anonymous had asked me about were there any risks to their nightly marijuana gummy to help them sleep, and I had to say, why, perhaps yes, there are some risks. So, yeah, I mean, it's definitely gonna change my counseling as well. I mean, I think I will use this. The people in this study are similar to my patients demographically. I thought the outcomes were relevant. The risk of marijuana use, the association is a higher rate of MI and stroke. They didn't really get into the benefits of daily cannabis use, so I can't really compare benefits to harms in this study. But it will definitely change my counseling, I think. I just think the robustness of the association and other data, the plausibility of the association was a lot too. It wasn't just a tiny increase in risk, and it was shown in all these different pre-specified subgroups. It was shown independent of tobacco use. So I think I can tell people the data that we have shows that there's a pretty strong association between coronary heart disease and cannabis use. And I have a lot of patients who are at high risk for heart disease. They have diabetes, hypertension, high cholesterol. They already have heart disease. They really should not be using marijuana the same way they probably shouldn't be using alcohol either.
It is interesting. I went to see I had like a staycation at the end of the year here, kind of using some PTO. My parents live in Maryland, and we went down to the zoo with my kids for the day, and I spent the night. And this is where I grew up, and it's the burbs outside of Baltimore, so it's not like this isn't the wire country we're talking about. And They've legalized marijuana for recreational purposes in Maryland, not just medicinal. And it's the shift I've seen with this. It's quite appalling. Like walking down the street of my hometown, it's very common walking past people just kind of openly smoking in public. Kind of the smell of marijuana. Most places you go to now, it's really been quite the shift. I hope we do get some more data here for some guidance from some health perspectives, because I feel like the floodgates have kind of opened with this, and I think we need some information to be given our patients.
Well, right, and of course, you're not allowed to smoke tobacco now in a lot of places, and you're not allowed to drink alcohol publicly. You're not allowed to have open containers of alcohol out on the street or in the zoo or strolling down the sidewalk, but they haven't gotten around to, um, enacting any of those laws for cannabis. So now that's the only substance that you can sort of use openly on the street.
Yeah, it's interesting. We'll see how it plays out. I'm sure in a decade it'll sort itself out a bit, although like some of the states have been doing this for a while, like Colorado, and kind of their MBC rates are astronomically high compared to other parts of the country, and they have some data on pre and post. I think we're starting to get a gist that there's some harms here.
Yeah, I mean, you and I will have the privilege of sort of seeing that shift in our professional lifetime, from 0 to 60 to maybe back to something a little slower.
Back to zero, then back to 60.
We, like, settle at 35.
Well, thanks for that article. That was really interesting. It's certainly some good information.
Yeah, I think it'll change my practice.
I think I want to selectively leave out the alcohol benefits, though, in my counseling.
John, you gotta go with what the data says.
Okay. So thank you for listening to the Addiction Medicine Journal Club. The best part of any journal club is the conversation, and we want to hear what you have to say. To have your opinions about the articles included in a future episode, send us your comments on social media, email, or join our Facebook group. The links are in the show notes. Original theme music was composed and performed by Benjamin Kennedy, audio editing by Aaron McHugh, CME support from MyCares, produced by Dr. Patrick Beeman and Arslan Media. Addiction Medicine Journal Club is intended for educational purposes only and should not be considered medical advice. The views expressed here are our own and do not necessarily reflect those of our employers or the authors of the articles we review. All patient information has been modified to protect their identities. Thank you for being part of the conversation and have a great day.